music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello, I'm Jordan Schneider, the host of ChinaEconTalk, here today with my podcast idol, Russ Roberts of, well, EconTalk. He's a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and the host of the EconTalk podcast, a weekly interview-based show vaguely about economics, but over time has evolved into an extended meditation on the human condition, particularly as we all strive to adapt to the 21st century. If you want a weekly cue to think more critically and holistically about the world, please do pause here and listen to a few ChinaEconTalk episodes and see if they've hooked you like they've hooked me over the past few years. So, even though this conversation has little to nothing to do with China, seeing as Russ served as the inspiration for this podcast, I hope you all find it interesting. Russ, welcome to ChinaEconTalk.
Great to be with you.
So Russ, how many hours of your life have you spent scheduling?
Well, that's a good question. So we've done 665 episodes roughly. It probably takes about, I don't know.
That was a joke. That was not a serious
What, the
question.
scheduling? Well, I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because, I wonder how much of my I wonder how much of my time on EconTalk is taken up by reading the books, the interview itself, the post-interview edits and additions of links to the episode, the scheduling. Sometimes a guest can take 15 or 20 emails back and forth because there's, some problem or other. So I thought it was a serious question.
What do you think the correlation is between good guests and, scheduling dilemmas or the amount of prep you feel like you have to put into each episode?
That's a really interesting question. My favorite episodes are almost never the favorite episodes of the listeners. Usually I've read the book already that the guest has written, if it's a book, and I read about 20 to 25 books a year for EconTalk, and the rest are based on articles or other things. But for me, a great conversation is where the guest and I explore some topic related to their ideas or their work, and something new comes up in my mind or their mind. And that's the sweet spot for me. It doesn't happen every week, of course. It's hard to do. Some people are uncomfortable talking to a stranger over Skype. And so I often have to deal with that, where a guest is sometimes not the best explainer or describer of their own ideas. I have to clarify stuff, or they're just quiet. They don't have much to say. They have a lot to write, but so sometimes you get surprised. You have a guest who writes a fabulous book but can't talk about it very well, and that happens. So you have to be prepared for that. You have to be prepared for the surprises that come up along the interview. I usually have a list of maybe 15 questions, maybe a few more, that I want to ask. And sometimes I get to all of them. And sometimes I do get to half of them because we go into other things. So I never want to just ask questions and have the guest answer them and then move down to the next question. I've, over the years, tried to make it more of a conversation and less of a, quote, interview. It's a slight difference, but I think it's an important one.
Sure. So let's talk through the kind of life cycle of the preparation and go in a little bit more detail into the points that you just brought up. So first, when it comes to finding the guests, have you learned to screen better over time?
Well, when I started, people said, well, this won't last very long because you'll run out of people to interview. That was in 2006. And I wasn't sure how many interviews I was going to do when I started, but pretty soon after I started, I realized I had to do one. I'd do it every week. So 52 roughly guests a year. Are there 52 interesting economists? 104, 156? How many are there? Well, it turns out there are quite a few, and you can actually interview a lot of people more than once. So that's another way to get fill up the hour. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, over time, I started to expand outside of economics. And I began by talking to people who did work that was related to economics. So an historian writing about the Great Depression, or a psychologist dealing with issues that economists are interested in. But in the last year or two, I've started to just deal with issues that are broadly related to, as you said, the human enterprise, and keeps me interested. So how do I find them? Well, people do send me suggestions. That's not uncommon. The suggestions, here's the groups they fall into. Guests that I have no interest in talking to because I'm not interested in what they write about. So I just say thank you and I don't invite them. Then there are guests I've already invited multiple times and they've turned me down. So even though you'd like to hear me interview so-and-so, I've tried. Really, I have. And then the third category, of course, is a guest who it's a great idea. I've never heard of them. I look at their work and I realize, wow, this is fantastic. I'm going to learn something. And I invite the guest and they say yes. So I spend a lot of time on the internet looking for interesting ideas and books and articles. Readers, listeners, people on Twitter make suggestions all the time, and I'm always happy to have them. I just ask people not to be disappointed. Oh, there's a fourth category, I guess I forgot about. You have to interview so-and-so. Turns out I've already interviewed him, sometimes more than once, but they just they don't check the archives, and they've only started listening for the last 6 months, and realize their archives. So all 660-plus episodes are available in one way or another without charge if you know how to look. So the way you look is you can go to econtalk.org, and every single episode is there. If you're on your phone, if you subscribe to EconTalk, you'll get the last 3 years. If you want episodes before 2015 or maybe 2016 now, you have to download a year at a time. When you search for EconTalk in your, say, podcast app on your iPhone or your Android phone, you'll have a chance to subscribe to the general feed, EconTalk, but there's also the old annual collections going back to 2006. So every single episode's available. They may not all be of interest to you. I wasn't as good an interviewer, I like to think, back then as I am now, but they're pretty good. There's some really interesting people back there. And some of them, those folks aren't alive anymore, so I can't interview them again. I've got interviews with Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and Ronald Coase and Christopher Hitchens, just to mention 4 great thinkers who, we've lost. So I'm happy that we have those interviews up there for people to listen to if they're interested.
I'm curious how you prep for the shows. Do you find yourself reading books differently?
Oh, absolutely. So there's 2 kinds of books I read. There's the book that I adore and love, and I read every word. And sometimes, very rarely, I'll read that book twice before I interview the guest. A recent example, I interviewed Sebastian Junger about his book, Tribe. I read the book, loved it, tried to get a hold of him, couldn't. Finally was able to get a hold of him. He did agree. By the time he agreed, I hadn't read the book in maybe a month or 2. It's a very short book. It's 100-something pages, and it's really even shorter than that compared to most 100-something page books. And so I read it again, and I loved it again. It's a great book. But most books fall into 2 categories. I either read them like that, not twice, but I read them through and enjoy the reading, and it's a book I'd read on my own. But every once in a while, I pick a book that looks interesting or the first chapter's fantastic, and then I realize, oh my gosh, this is a very long book. I'm not interested in every page, and I don't have time to read every page. So what I do then is I read. I don't read every word, but I do read every page. I skim, but I skim in a kind of scanning the page kind of way to see if there are any ideas or things that I would miss. I want to, before I do the interview, I want to have a full picture of the book and the author's ideas. And again, sometimes that requires you to read every word, but not always, because there are many things in the book I'm not going to talk about. What I don't want to do, I don't want to say, well, I'll just find 10 or 15 interesting things. I'll just leaf through it. I don't feel that's fair to the author. So I try to get the picture of the entire book, either by reading every word or certainly reading or looking at every page. And then when I'm done, I sit down and I sometimes I've highlighted sections that interest me, and I use those to generate the questions. But usually what I do is I just sort of sit back and I try to think of what's the narrative of ideas that would be of the most interest to a listener who might not read the book, that'll give them the flavor of what's most interesting about this book. Sometimes there's things in the book I'm not interested in. I'm not going to ask the author about them unless they're related to other things. But in general, I try to pick the most interesting ideas in the book and give the author the chance to expound on them. And it used to take me a fairly long time to generate those questions. As I've gotten more experience, that piece of the prep time is extremely short. And having said that, I still occasionally forget, after the interview's over, I think, why didn't I ask about, fill in the blank? But in general, I have a pretty good list of the things I think not only are interesting, but that when tied together will give the listener an overview of the author's ideas. And that's the ideal situation. As I said, sometimes you get a book that's kind of a snoozer, and you realize we're going to have to talk about some things they're only related to the book. We're going to have to take this in directions that I didn't expect because, when I picked up the book or read the first chapter or saw the review, I didn't realize fully what it was about. And that happens a couple times, 3 times a year, maybe 4 times a year. And you got to roll with the punches there.
So you mentioned this idea of having a sense of responsibility to the interviewee. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So as I've gotten older and more experienced, I try hard, it's not always succeed, try hard to remember that the show is not about me. It is my show. I get about 50% of the airtime, maybe a little bit less in an ideal world, maybe 35% of the airtime. Occasionally I have comments to make on what the guests say. It's not just that I ask long questions in a conversation. Again, I don't want to just ask them a question and have them answer. So I get a decent amount of airtime, and I'm the host. So I can start to believe, if I'm not careful, that the show's about me and my fascinating ideas. And I think that makes for a less interesting show than if the show's about the guest and the guest's fascinating ideas and occasionally my commentary on them. So, I think and also, to be practical, I want people to enjoy being on the show so that they'll come back and that other people will want to be on the show who are interesting. So I try to put the guest at the center of the episode, not me. And it's easy to say that, and you think, well, of course it's not about you, but our egos sometimes get in the way. So the challenge is for me to make sure that the intellectual content, the educational content that the guest brings to the table is the center of the episode. Now, occasionally I'm going to have a strong disagreement with that. And listeners like that. They like when I politely, respectfully disagree with the guest. But in general, across the spectrum of guests who I agree with, disagree with, et cetera, the goal is to let them expound on what they've been working on, thinking about, et cetera, and to let them shine. I try to always give them the last word for sure. And I try to pick the last word to be one that lets them summarize something ideally in a way that moves the listener or informs the listener. It's a show about education. And of course, if it's just about education, nobody wants to listen. It has to be somewhat entertaining. But my goal is to learn something. People will say to me, how could you let so-and-so on your show for whatever reason? I always say, well, I learned a lot from them. And I hope you did too. Or people say, that was the worst episode you ever did. That person's a jerk or an idiot or a fool or fill in the blank. And I always think, and I write some back sometimes, you missed a chance to learn something. I don't agree with the person either, but I did learn this, that, and the other, and you missed a chance. So a lot of us, I think, including me, we turn off our brain when we hear somebody who we don't agree with or we think is wrong, and we miss a chance to learn something we might otherwise have learned.
Sure. So coming back more to the interview itself, you talked a little bit about the closing idea of these moving moments that you've been able to generate over time. I'm curious if you think about the general arc of the hour-long interviews as well, and how you try to structure them, or is it more of a free-form thing?
It's a good question. So you and I are doing this over Skype, and almost all of my interviews are done over Skype. I do maybe 5 a year that are face-to-face, either because I'm out in California and there's some interesting guest nearby, or someone happens to be in Washington and wants to do it face-to-face. And people always say to me, well, face-to-face is better. And that's not true. Could be better, but often it's not. And the reason is that face-to-face means I'm sitting with a stranger, a person I have no connection to other than I've invited them to be on my program. They're sitting across from me alone in a very quiet room. It's a room that's not particularly designed to be comfortable in and conversational because we don't want any distractions, audio distractions. And sometimes the author or the guest is shy and is uncomfortable being 5 feet away from a stranger. And worse, the stranger, that's me, I'm not always paying attention. So they're trying to make eye contact with me to make some important, powerful point that they feel very strongly about. And I'm looking at my notes. I'm watching the clock. I'm making sure the Skype connection's still good. And, I warn them in advance of that, but it's very disarming. It's not a easy thing to sit there and when, and keep your focus on the conversation as the guest when the host isn't exactly giving you 100%. But I can't give 100%. I have to be aware of, how many questions are coming up? Do I want to cut off this answer at this point, or do I want to let them just keep going? Ooh, should I interject a clarifying question? They just use some jargon. Should I stop them and ask them to explain it? Do I interrupt? What if they're just rambling on? I have guests sometimes that just ramble. I'm thinking, I'm bored. My listeners are bored. I think I better, interject. So all that's going on in my mind, as well as the question you just asked about the arc of the hour. I want to make sure that certain things get into the hour, and I have to keep an eye on where we are in the narrative arc and where we are on the clock.
So let's talk about interruptions for a second. I feel like this is something that the best interviewers feel comfortable with, confident with, and sort of just jump in. And from my perspective, it seems to me like that this is one of the parts of doing interviews in person that comes more naturally. That is a little 100%. Easier. Interrupting people on Skype is awkward. There's this time delay.
Yeah. So actual conversation, the amount of interruption in an actual conversation depends on the person and the style and the culture you're in and all that. And you're 100% right that when you're face-to-face, I can send nonverbal cues to my conversational partner that I have something to say or I'm interested in responding to what you're saying. And I can't do that on Skype. And as you say, it's worse than that because there's a delay. And many times I've been interviewing someone and I try to interject something and they keep talking. And at first you think, oh, wow, they're really rude. They don't let me get a word in. But it's really that they didn't hear it. And so I will edit that out, my interjection, because it makes them look rude because they didn't let me interject something.
Sure.
But that isn't what's going on. They literally don't hear it. It's either a bad connection or there's a delay. So when I started EconTalk, and you can hear this, I'm sure, in the early episodes, I interjected and interrupted a lot more because I thought it made it more natural sounding. It's more conversational. Some people complained about it, and I thought, yeah, maybe I interrupt too much. So I try to interrupt less now than I did. I let the guest, unless they're rambling and are incoherent, which is rare, they're just sort of off the track, and I'm thinking, where's this going? I try not to interrupt, even though in a conversation that was face-to-face, I might be doing that. So the other thing I do, and perceptive listeners have noticed this, is that I send positive verbal cues, even though it's over Skype. So I'll say yep and uh-huh and sure and things like that under my breath, or a little bit away from the microphone, just to encourage them, just to let them know, I think that's the right point, or I think you're on the right track. And so I think, those are available as sort of like just positive noises. It's not much more than that. But I think it's a big challenge. It's a big problem with the current technology that I think will get better probably. Those delays, I think, will probably go down.
So what other things besides interjections do you do to try to get these guests comfortable?
I don't do much. When we start the process of the interview and I connect with them over Skype or Google Hangout or whatever it is, I sometimes spend 30 seconds trying to establish a little bit of rapport, but a lot of times people are busy. They're already giving me an hour, sometimes now a little more than an hour. So I feel kind of I think it's unfair to chit-chat with them, to try to relax them. And so I do that in the interview. I'll tell you two other things I do. When I first started, and again, if you go back and listen, I would have a opening question that might be something like, ask them about their book or some topic I want to ask about. Let's say it's tax rates, just to pick a boring and uninteresting example. So I would put in my notes tax rates after my introduction. And what I found I did, and it drove me crazy, and I'm sure it drove listeners crazy, and I hear it on other podcasts and I hear it on other online interviews, is that having introduced the guest and now I'm about to ask the first question, I really would struggle to get that question out. I'm a little nervous. The guest is a little nervous. And I'd do the rambling thing myself. I'd say, well, I wanted to start with, tax rates and their impact on say, work incentive. I mean, what do you think I'm not sure. There's a lot of differences in the literature. There's different, where do you stand? That kind of opening. And if you go back, you'll hear me kind of, the word for it, it's not a word, it's the right way to say it. I'm fumphing around. I'm just kind of a little bit lost, and that's probably Yiddish. But after a while, I realized that's just so hard to listen to, especially as the opening 30 seconds. And often it would go on because I'd be kind of trying to find the end of the question. And so what I've done for a long, long time now is I script the introduction and the first question word for word. And that might be 75 words. And I probably didn't do the introduction word for word in the old days. I'd say so-and-so is a professor of economics at Sunshine State University. Their book is da-da-da-da. And welcome to EconTalk. But now I give it a little more thought, and I write it out verbatim, and I write out that first question verbatim. And that first question usually has some introductory remarks, say, about the book. And when I used to do those on the fly, they're awful. First I justified it to myself saying, well, it's more conversational, it's off the cuff. But it's not.
But it's boring.
It's boring.
I think you talked about the kind of respect for the author and the respect for the audience idea, and it's like, okay, how many X thousands of people are going to be listening to this? And you couldn't take the 30 seconds to script out the part when you were nervous. It's funny because I actually had the same exact experience of my first handful of episodes where I would stutter on the first question, stutter on the interview, and then Kaiser Kuo of Seneca basically told me, Jordan, just script the first few questions and things will go a lot smoother. Yeah. And they have, which is it's a funny thing how, even after, you recording hundreds of episodes, there's still a little bit of nerves because, as you said, you're talking to a stranger.
Yep. And I just gave you a bunch of yeps and an absolutely and a little laughter, and you just gave me some laughter. Those are those kind of positive cues I was talking about. But the point is exactly right, that there's that nervousness about I'm not sure where it's going. And then you can also work yourself into a state because you realize, oh my gosh, I'm really rambling on this question. And then you're really in trouble. So anyway, I script those out, and I usually script out a bunch of the questions, but I don't always end up asking them in the word-for-word way because something may have come up in the meanwhile.
So you mentioned that there are other podcasters, interviewers who you admire. Could you talk a little bit about who are the folks you look up to who do this sort of thing?
I don't listen to many, actually. I'm not a commuter. I don't exercise enough. And when I do, I don't listen to podcasts. I don't have a dog.
What do you listen to when you exercise?
Rock, Irish music, typically.
Irish music,
yeah.
Okay.
If I'm doing something that's physically demanding, I like bluegrass, Irish music, music that has a driving beat, but not ballads, not Irish ballads. But so I don't really listen to many podcasts. I don't have a lot of role models because I don't, or people to steal from because I just don't listen to them. This American Life is is fabulous. And I'm blanking now on the other one I really like.
Terry Gross.
No, I don't listen to Terry. I know I've heard, no,
not into her.
no. Well, I just don't. I think she's great. Whenever I've listened to her, I've enjoyed it. I'm thinking of another podcast. It's not 99% Invisible. It's another one that's skipping my mind right now. It'll come in a second. But here's the thing: most of the great podcasts, and I mean the kind that blow me away, where I'm just moved to tears or just I get goosebumps. They're doing something different than what I'm doing. They're running a online storytelling magazine. This American Life is vignettes and stories from the American experience, and that's not what I do. I'd love to do that. I just don't do it.
Sure.
I interview people. So if you're asking me who are the great interviewers, yeah, Terry Gross is a fabulous interviewer. I don't hear her very often. There aren't a lot of people that I think of or know of. I've kind of tried, I've had to develop my own style. I wish I had somebody I could steal more from, but I don't.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the University of San Francisco. As you all know, I'm currently on the job hunt and have recently been spending a lot of time on LinkedIn looking for policy-related jobs at tech firms. I keep running into these job listings with titles like economist at places like Airbnb and Uber, but my sorry technical skills mean I never instant apply for those. If I'd only known that at the University of San Francisco's new Master's in Applied Economics, in 2 short years as opposed to the 6 or 7 it takes for a PhD, you could get the skills needed to join one of those teams. The program combines economics training with practical skills and data analytics needed to understand the new digital economy. Plus, for those non-US students out there, as the program is designated STEM, you can keep working in America for 3 years after you graduate with no visa issues. To learn more and get an application fee waiver, go to usfca.edu/Jordan. Now accepting applications for this fall. Do you think Adam Smith would have done a good job as the host of a interview-based podcast?
I don't think so. He did have a characteristic that I like to think helps me, which is intellectual curiosity. I think what makes Econ Talk one of the things I like about the show, and as you point out, we've gone to a wider array of topics, is that I don't just talk about Bitcoin every week. Now, I have many listeners who wish I did talk about Bitcoin every week or monetary theory. And we have a lot of episodes on Bitcoin, and they go back a long way. We were early on Bitcoin, and we have a lot of episodes on monetary theory, but I don't have a lot more to learn right now about Bitcoin or monetary theory. I don't want to sound arrogant. It's not that I know everything about them. I don't. Nothing close. The problem is I don't think there's anyone else who does either. If I could meet that person, if I could learn something from them, I'm still happy to talk about either of those. But in general, I'm going to talk about other things, things I think are more interesting that I can learn more from those interviews. And so that's my goal. Now, Adam Smith, he was interested in tons of stuff: astronomy, economic history, fascinating questions of how we should organize education, the role of trade, the human condition, what makes us tick, the respect we want from our people around us. So he was interested in tons of stuff. And people call him the first economist. I really think of him as the first social scientist. He was interested in psychology and history and philosophy and economics and sociology and anthropology. So, he wanted to think in a somewhat systematic way about those things, which is why he still has something to teach us. But I think in that sense, I think he'd make a good podcast host. On the other hand, he was a bit of an offbeat person as far as we know. We don't know that much about his personality, but he had a lot of close friends. He was a social person. So maybe he'd been good at it. I don't know. Hard to know.
Okay.
I don't think his recording ability was very high. So I don't think he had a good Skype connection in 1759. So he'd have to maybe just chat with David Hume, and they'd write it down. Yeah. That would be good. Have somebody take notes. I'm sure I'd love to have those transcripts.
We unfortunately cannot listen to the Hume-Smith hour, but we still do have some of the standouts from EconTalk's library. So I'm curious if there are a few shows that were particularly memorable to you over these years that you'd like to recount, and any life lessons or podcasting, interviewing lessons you think you've learned from some of these standouts.
Sure. By the way, the podcast I was trying to think of a minute ago is Radio Lab. I love Radio Lab.
Oh, sure.
I've only listened to maybe 20 episodes, but 15 of the 20 just blew me away. I do get inspired when I listen to a great podcast like that, but it isn't quite what I'm doing, so it's not that easy to learn from it. So what are the episodes that are most memorable to me? Well, a bunch of them stand out. Interviewing Milton Friedman shortly before he passed away was very gratifying and moving for me. I think I talked too much in the episode, but it still was pretty cool. And I interviewed him in his apartment in San Francisco, I don't know, maybe the 30th floor of a very tall building, maybe the 40th. It was scary and beautiful, and I'm recording face-to-face. And I knew Milton a little bit, so I wasn't terribly nervous about that. I was nervous that it wouldn't be recorded accurately. There was some noise outside from construction that was drifting up, and I just, I knew it was precious because I was aware that I might not be able to interview him or see him again, and it turned out to be the case. So that one is special. We divided that into 2 parts, and those are the old days. Neither part's very long. We wouldn't do that now, but there's a part on his book Capitalism and Freedom and a part on his book on monetary theory, a monetary history of the United States. And we talk about inflation, and it's a good conversation. So that's special. I interviewed Christopher Hitchens at his house. He invited me over for lunch beforehand. We had a scotch, just like you'd expect. I don't remember what the scotch was, to my shame. I think it was Johnny Walker, but I'm not 100% sure. Christopher Hitchens was an extraordinary conversationalist. And I was lucky enough to interview him about his hero, George Orwell. And so I find that was just a thrill, and I'm still, many people say it's one of their favorite episodes. It was a long time ago now, but he's just an amazing expositor and an amazing speaker of the English language. The interview I did with Brendan O'Donohoe on potato chips is a favorite of many listeners and of my own. And I don't know if I talk about it on the air, but Brendan was at the time a exec for Frito-Lay, the potato chip snack company, and he invited me to come out to their factory, which I really wanted to do. I was really interested in industrial food processing. I'm a strange person.
As one is.
Who isn't? But I can make it interesting, I think. And so I thought that would be really fun, but it was a few hours away, and I thought I don't really have time for it. Instead, what we did is we spent an hour together in a grocery where he showed me where all the Frito-Lay products were and why they were where they were. And then we talked about it on air for an hour. And I'm pretty sure we did talk about the fact that we toured the grocery, but that was incredibly fun, incredibly interesting. Not what you think. So that was really fun. I had a very challenging conversation with Jeffrey Sachs that's memorable to me. I had interviewed Nina Monk. If you're interested, you should go back. You start with the Nina Monk episode. Nina Monk wrote a book about Jeffrey Sachs, an economist doing development projects in Africa. And her book was very critical. She started off as a big fan of him, but after she saw what was going on, she was less excited. And she wrote a very open-eyed book about the challenges of development in Africa and fighting poverty. And Jeffrey Sachs did not like that book and asked to come on the program. I thought at the time maybe I should, invite him on to answer her. But then I thought, EconTalk, Jeffrey Sachs doesn't need to respond to EconTalk. He can be in the New York Times whenever he wants. But he asked to be on, and I said, sure, that'd be great. So he came on, and I'll just say he was critical of me, and I was not prepared for how critical he was. So that was a character builder. And I handled it pretty well. Not great, but it was an interesting experience. Learned a lot from it. So that was a memorable one. I've interviewed a lot of people who are my heroes. So I got to interview Mark Halperin, who's my favorite novelist, who wrote Winter's Tale and Soldier of the Great War and The Pacific. He's just an incredible prose writer. He wrote a book about property rights, and so that was an excuse to talk to him. I got to interview Bill James. Bill James, who writes on baseball and other things as well, but we talked about data and statistics and what we can learn from them. and that was last year. That was an amazing experience for me. Milton Friedman, Ronald Coase, probably one of my 5 favorite economists. Also, interviewed him. I think he was 102. That was a lot of fun. And I would say I'm probably missing a few people. Alex Guarnaschelli, the cook, the chef who was on Chopped. That was a blast. Talking to her about how to run a great restaurant in New York City and the challenges of that. And when you have the ability to ask dumb questions of really smart people, you learn some great things. And so there's just a lot of them over the years that gave me a thrill. Literally gave me a thrill where I'm nervous because I'm so excited for the chance to talk to so-and-so. So that's a wonderful part of my job.
It's an oddly emotional experience listening to you talk about these episodes because for a number of them, when you say them, I can see in my mind exactly where I was listening. It's interesting how these episodes, they kind of they hit the audience in a certain moment, and sometimes they end up resonating in a way that seems kind of outsized, and they just kind of like line up with wherever your life and head is at the time. I'm curious if you could walk us through maybe some of the most interesting audience responses that you've had to these certain shows, and what particular episodes have meant to different people.
Yeah, I don't know. That's hard because, as you know, one of the challenges of being a podcast host is that you're not always sure how people react because most of them don't tell you by definition. I get emails.
Sure.
I get emails. Any episode, though, that I think is great. Well, I'll say a couple things. First of all, there are episodes that I don't love that listeners do. That always thrills me. It's like, I put an episode out and think, oh, this was so disappointing.
So we got a little Freudian slip there. You said you were going to say students?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think of myself as a teacher. I taught in the classroom for 30 years, and I don't teach in the classroom anymore. And people say, do you miss teaching? And I think, well, I'm still doing it. I'm just not doing it in the classroom. And EconTalk is my classroom to some extent. As I said earlier,
Sure.
My goal is to help people learn stuff. And when people ask questions say things that I think are confusing or have ramifications that they haven't explored, that's where we're doing the learning. And anyway, or just listening to the guest. So, a lot of times, as I said, I'll put out an episode that I think is sort of disappointing and people love it. And that always thrills me. It always makes me happy. And occasionally I'll put out an episode that I think...
It doesn't make you angry in any way?
No.
This dumb audience, they have no taste.
No. Here's what I struggle with. What I struggle with is when someone says, this is the worst episode you've ever done. And that'll be a comment or a response on Twitter or an email. And I always want to write back, oh, do you disagree with the author? Because that's what they really mean. They really mean is you've never had a guest on who I disagreed with so much. And that's not a good argument for calling it a really bad episode. To me,
Sure.
I don't want to have episodes on where people just agree with me. And the other thing I love, it's not quite what you asked, but I'm going to tell you anyway. People will say, how could you let so-and-so say that and not respond? How could you let them get away with that? And I always, when I can, I write back and I say, first of all, if I spoke up every time I disagreed with a guest, the guest would get no time. I'd be talking the whole time. I disagree with lots of things my guests say. But the more important point is, so what's the harm? You're worrying that listeners might think it's true because I didn't point out that it's wrong? That's your job, listener. I trust my audience. I try. A lot of times somebody will say something, I'll challenge it, they'll respond, and I think it's a really bad response. But I'm not going to then get into an argument with them. I expect my listeners to understand, oh, boy, they really didn't have a good answer to that. Or vice versa. I have a lot of, I love it when people say, you
lost that one.
Yeah,
Russ.
exactly. Yeah. So-and-so got the better of Russ in their exchange. And I'm thinking, oh, so you agree with them beforehand and after. Okay. And all the people who disagree with them and say, oh, no, Russ got the better of it. I always think, oh, you already agreed with me. It's so subjective and so much based on your previous biases. And it's kind of funny.
Do you feel like shows in general are predestined to be good, or do you feel like you can sort of save shows halfway through? Or I mean, I guess it's good not to get resigned after like a week first 20 minutes.
Well, I don't edit my episodes other than when I lose my train of thought or the guest coughs or I cough or whatever, except for in a few exceptions. And those exceptions are almost always where I'll tell a guest. It's not, every once in a while a guest says to me, I shouldn't have said such and such. Can we cut that out? And my view is almost always yes, because I'm not a news show. It's not a gotcha show. I don't care that if you look stupid on my show, I don't want you to look stupid. No reason. So if you made a mistake, you said something you regret, I'm happy to take it out unless it ruins the flow of the conversation. And very rarely, every once in a while, we'll go down a rabbit hole, the guest and I will realize, boy, that really was a incredible digression that went nowhere. And I will cut that out if occasionally, but very, very rarely, like once a year, maybe. So in general, if it's not going well, I'm just sitting there going, boy, this is not exciting. I try to amp up my energy level at that point and try to think of more interesting things to say to keep the listeners entertained. And again, I have a very low bar for a good episode. My good episode is I learned something. I mean, to me, that's that's fabulous. I don't want to really suggest it's a low bar. It's really great. And it might just be one thing. And I had a guest on earlier this year, or last year, recently, A.J. Jacobs, who wrote a book called Thanks 1,000. And we talked about gratitude. We talked about the book, which had a lot of economic content, even though it was about gratitude. But we also just talked about the psychological aspects of being grateful and thanking people and what that means. And in the course of the conversation, he mentioned that he has he keeps a list called One Thing. And in One Thing, when he goes to a lecture or has a conversation or reads a book or comes back from a movie or whatever it is, if there's something that he wants to remember from that, and it's usually just one thing, he writes it down. And I think that's just a fabulous habit. And I've started my own file on my computer called One Thing, where I do that. If something comes up in a conversation that I want to remember or that I think is precious, I write it down because you will not remember it. And it's lovely to go back through it and just be stimulated by the last year's one thing. But in general, one thing is a huge number. One is a big number. So if I can have a conversation where one thing comes out of it that's memorable, and I'm not going to describe this explicitly, but I have lots of episodes that I thought were duds, where the guests were not that exciting. But I learned one precious thing that I think about years later and still remember. And that makes an episode great to me. You know, that's a high level of achievement. I don't mean on my part, I mean on the result of the conversation. So, you know, when you have a quote boring episode, the other comment I get from that I love from listeners is, you know, when I looked at the title of this one, I thought this is going to be horrible, but it wasn't. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course it wasn't. Why would I give you a horrible guest? Usually I pick the guest to be interesting. Yeah. And even though they might not look interesting, I had to talk to them for an hour and I usually had to read their book. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. Trust me.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I do have this tension that you mentioned before, where sometimes you read the book and you read the first chapter and you only have so many hours in a week. So you can't pre-read a book and then reach out to someone, right? So it is tricky, because sometimes I feel like I get myself into episodes where after doing the research, it's kind of like, all right, I guess we're you kind of lose that thrill that you initially got when the person agreed to it.
Yeah, there's the I'm halfway through the book and I realize this is not interesting. But usually it's usually that's the goal that's the challenge of being a good interviewer, I think, is when you have a situation like that and you make lemonade out of those lemons, because you can do it. It's usually whatever caused you to pick the book or the guest in the first place, there's something there that's special. You just have to uncover it. And again, it might of the 60 minutes, 20 or 30 might be somewhat dull. But there's going to be my goal is that there's a gem somewhere. Ideally there's 50 or 60 minutes of jewelry, but that's unrealistic. And so sometimes you gotta hope for one.
Can you talk about the challenges and possibilities inherent in interviewing people who have very different backgrounds from you? I feel like I kind of gravitate or have gravitated too much towards like white American youngish men who are interested in China, just because I know exactly what their wavelength is, and I'm like pretty sure we're gonna have a fun conversation. And for you, there's the like PhD economist, like libertarian, who's writing about economic theory or what have you.
Yep.
But I'm curious how you kind of adapt yourself and your preparation and your approach to folks who you don't. What's in Chinese, it's ijianrugu. It's like as soon as you see them, it's like you've known them for a long time.
Yeah. There's three aspects to that. I'm not sure I'm going to remember all three, but I'll try. I'll get started. First, there are people who disagree with me, who come at the world very differently than I do. And that's always interesting. Listeners really like that. I try to get those guests on as much as possible. They don't always agree because they're afraid they're not going to be treated well. One of my favorite episodes will be the ones where the guest at the end says, I enjoyed that. And you can hear their surprise in their voice because they weren't expecting to. They agreed to it, either their publisher.
They put their body armor on.
Yeah, they were all ready to go to war. And then it turned out we had a good conversation. So those are always fun. The non-economists, for me, I've always had wide interests, and I read fairly widely. So when I have a guest on that is outside of economics, I usually have read something about their field or something about their work that, besides the book itself, that I can bring to bear on it. And I think that's really important, this point about people not like you, because for me, the part that I find intellectually satisfying about being the host, I don't know how much listeners appreciate or enjoy this, but for me, a lot of the intellectual thrill of the interview is realizing some connection that the guest did not realize, or seeing a connection with a previous episode or a theme in economics that is, even though I'm not talking to an economist, and sometimes I'll invite a guest and they'll say, oh, I can't be on your program. I don't know any economics. And I say, well, that's my job. I'll talk about the economics of what you're talking about, and then you'll respond to it, or you'll talk about the history or the psychology or whatever it is. So for that kind of diversity, obviously you have to read outside of economics, and I do. So that's I can pull that off to some degree. And then the third kind, people not like me or people who aren't white males, I wish I had more of that kind of diversity. Most economists are men. So I've tried fairly hard, it's not easy, to invite more women onto the program. And they often aren't interested. Some of the more illustrious women in economics are very much in demand, and they don't want to give me an hour. They just turn me down. But increasingly women come on the program, and that's great. And I'd like to have more. So that's a challenge. It's really easy to talk to people who are like you. And I also would add that the people who are just like me, or quote, somewhat just like me, the intellectual brotherhood of free market oriented people, nobody wants to listen to people nodding for an hour. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I agree. Oh yeah, that. Oh yeah. And so one of the reasons I've moved away from from guests who are quote like me is because it's just not interesting, and I don't learn anything from those folks. Now that's not always true. I have lots of wonderful guests who are free market oriented. I've learned a ton from in real life and on the program. But I'm not interested when someone will write a book that they know I agree with, and they think, oh, of course I'll want to interview them. And the answer is not really, because I already know all that. It's not so interesting to me. And so I've tried to diversify on that front.
How has your emotional relationship to this show evolved over time?
Well, I thought I've always was interested in audio, and I've always been interested in interviewing, or at least for a long time. And I always wondered whether I could do it on a regular basis. The idea of doing a weekly show seemed daunting. So when I first started, I thought, well, I'll just do this now and then, and we'll see what happens. And as I said earlier in our conversation, at one point I realized it would be a good idea to have it every week. And I wasn't sure I could do it. I didn't know if that was, like, I wasn't sure I could generate the guests. I wasn't sure if I could find the time. And eventually I just, worked at it, and it had to happen that way, and it did. So it started off as sort of an experiment, EconTalk. It's not like it's an important part of my career. But over time, as our listener base has grown steadily, it's increasingly gratifying to me. So when you ask about my emotional connection to the show, the emails that I get make me realize that it's almost certainly the most important thing I've done. I mean, I've written 4 books, and I have videos that I'm proud of, and I've written a lot of essays and blog posts. But EconTalk is probably probably the most important thing I've done professionally, and so I'm very proud of it and deeply gratified that people find it interesting. I was just talking with John Popola, who was the co-creator with me of the Cane's Hack rap videos. And when they came out, a journalist told me that would be my epitaph. He did the Cane's Hack rap videos. And I thought, well, that's pretty depressing. But I'm pretty proud of those too. And with EconTalk, it's not that I'm not proud of my books. I like my books, but it surprised me over the years how much emotional satisfaction and connection I have with doing EconTalk. It's an incredible blessing to me that Liberty Fund, which is the sponsor of the program and supported it from the beginning, has allowed me to do this and allowed me to meet hundreds of fascinating people and spend an hour with them in conversation. And it's enriched my life beyond words. It's also kept me intellectually alive. As I've gotten older, I'm 64 years old, and it would be tempting to just kind of work less. And instead, I find myself more curious than ever, more interested in learning about things more widely. And I think it's because of EconTalk.
Russ Roberts, thanks so much for coming on China EconTalk.
It's my pleasure.
China EconTalk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from Sup China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.